You're listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent talk.
Well, happy Thursday evening, folks. This is Scotty Roberts. Welcome to my show, the Intrepid radio program, right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. Come on over, find out all the goodness that is Odyssey Radio, and of course all the other places where you can find this show in its audio format for your listening pleasure. Now, if you'd like to come and see the video simulcast of this show, you can come on over to my YouTube channel, where there is also the live chat room going on right now as this broadcast is carrying out. And that's the chat room inhabited by the other Intrepids out there that would like to come in and take their time talking to each other and talking about this show. Come on over to youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. You can join the fun over there. And at the same time, why don't you go on over and you can check out the archives. We've got every show we have ever done on Odyssey Radio archived. And we began doing our shows on Odyssey Radio in August of 2019. So you're going to find over 300 shows archived over there on the YouTube channel. Go take a look and get involved in some of the series that are there. If you go to my YouTube page and you scroll down the main page, you're going to see all the different sections of different radio shows I've done. And of course, there's many things there that predate our time on Odyssey, so you can see a lot of cool stuff. So, there it is. Come on over. And by the way, if you want to find some good gear to wear, I've got a lot of shirt designs, hoodie designs, things like that, things I've designed. We did usually one for every one of the series we've been in. But you go over to my page. If you go over to the YouTube channel and you look at the scroll bar down underneath the video, you're going to see places where you can go find the merchandise that I put up. And so go to Etsy, etsy.com/shop/sonofapatriot, and you can see all our stuff. So avail yourself of some good t-shirts, hoodies, coffee mugs, things like that. And you're going to find a lot of fun stuff over there. Thank you very much in advance. And so let's move into yesterday. Picking up where we left off from yesterday, we're talking about Joseph. Now, there is, as I'm researching Joseph, there is so much, let's call it ancillary information out there, supportive information, that maybe doesn't always directly affect the story of Joseph, but talks about the times, talks about the theories, talks about why this Pharaoh is probably the Pharaoh who Joseph dealt with, or why, no, it's this Pharaoh, or why it's the Hyksos period, or why it's not the Hyksos period, or why it's the intermediate period, or why it's the 12th dynasty, why it's 1800 BC versus 1700 BC, or 1500 BC, or 1650 BCE. So you've got all this information that's out there that conflicts with one another, and a lot of it gets really tied up in the faith story as well. Well, God certainly wouldn't have allowed this to happen under that Pharaoh because of this or that. You know, those are the things that I say, that's great. If you are a person of faith and you want to hinge all these stories and all their historical elements on faith, you really have to be part of that faith story, that faith experience, in order to be able to accept that answer, and that there is no other answer outside that parameter. I had one of my old seminary professors who I respect deeply, whose work I followed deeply, who got me first. He was the first man when I was 11 years old. I met him at my church, and he got me involved in the story of Moses and Amenhotep II. And he didn't bring up Hatshepsut at that time, but he brought up all these pharaohs that I started along that path believing. And he became he was the president of the seminary where I attended. He went on to become the chair of history at Northwestern University. And he also went on after that to become the president of the Near East Biblical Archaeological Society. And he's written a lot. He's lectured a lot. He had a book called Egypt in Bible History, a small book, about that thick. And he wrote that in my seminary days, back in the early 1980s. And so I did a lot of research based on him, and he is somebody who has supported some of the things that I'll be talking about tonight. But all of these, he once told me, he said, Scotty, when you write about these stories in history, you have to filter them through your faith. And I said, but if I do that, then I'm stuck in that faith box. What do you get? What happens when you find history that might controvert an element of our faith? And that's the big question. So I think that you have to sometimes step away from faith and look at the story for as it is. I've said many times, the Bible has efficacious history. Its veracity is a phenomenal, amazing veracity to the history in the Bible. But the faith story is what they've wrapped around these historical events. And so stories like Moses, stories like Joseph, these are stories that get lost in the faith story. And I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean, they are so wrapped up in the faith story that we forget to, especially when we're in those faiths, we forget to do the research and look deeper. And so it's really tough sometimes to come up with the actual name of the person or the king or the thing or the that or the date, especially when it's not given to us. The only names we're given in the story of Joseph in the Bible are Potiphar, the man who gave him his first job as a house slave, a steward, and whose wife tried to seduce him. And then we have later, after Joseph is risen to power, he's given the wife, the daughter of Potiphar, as a wife. And now the big question is this the same guy? Potiphar and Potiphar. They're the only two names given other than Joseph and his brothers. And so we have to ask that question. Are these guys, or some have speculated these are titles of certain kinds of people in power in Egypt, not necessarily a name or a personal name. So we're going to go on tonight. We're going to cover more of this story. Now, I've talked about how the story of Joseph, I believe, takes place in the Hyksos period. And that's that period that runs from, I had the exact dates up here. I got to call it up. I got about 1565 or 1650 to 1630 through 1523 is the Hyksos period. That 108 or so years of this time when the Hyksos peoples, the people groups who had infiltrate's a negative word, it sounds like spying, who had assimilated into Egyptian culture in the northern delta, eventually took over the northern throne of Egypt. They took advantage when there was not a pharaoh on the throne, and they divided the kingdom. And so the southern kingdom, upper Egypt, which is in the south, you're talking Thebes, which is Luxor, and everything down below, down the Nile, that was all southern Egypt or upper Egypt. And lower Egypt was in the north, and that was the Nile Delta area, including Menepher, or modern-day Memphis, which really expands into what is modern-day Cairo, and the land of Goshen, where the Hebrew slaves lived off to the east of that, and up in the Nile Delta region. And so you've got this division for 108 years, and there was a pharaoh who came in and finally crushed the Hyksos, who had taken over the rule, and ousted them out of the country, and he subjugated the rest of the people, the remnant of. And it was either subjugation that was ironclad slavery, or those people entered a caste of servitude to the Egyptians. And the Egyptians did not like the Hyksos, especially after this takeover, this usurpation of the northern throne. They hated the Hyksos, and they hated shepherds because of it. They hated the shepherding people, the kings who were the shepherding people, the Hyksos. And so when you're looking at this and trying to set these dates as to when all this took place, we've got a pretty solid figure of 1446 for the Exodus, of then 80 years earlier the birth of Moses, and Hatshepsut as a young girl finding him in the basket. That would have been around 1526 during the first year of the reign of Tutmosis I, who was the son or the grandson of Ahmose, Ahmose, another variation of the name Moses the first, who was the Pharaoh who drove out the Hyksos. And this would have been the father. And so if Joseph came to power under the Hyksos kings, it would have been sometime during that previous 108-year period. Now, the biblical story tells us that at the time of the Exodus, the Hebrews had lived in Israel or in Egypt for 430 years. So the 40 years captivity. But if you take the dates from when Joseph would have been coming in under a Hyksos king, let's say it's way at the very beginning of the Hyksos period. You've got 100 years, and then you got about another 80 years. You've only got about 200-year period, a little bit less, for that sojourn in Egypt. So maybe it encompassed some other things prior to that, but either the dating system was off, or my characterization of the Hyksos being the kings under which Joseph entered the land is off. But let's take a look. Let's examine that a little bit today, and that's where I want to get with some of this. Now, we were reading yesterday the biblical passage about Joseph coming into the land of Egypt as a slave, how he goes to the house of Potiphar, how Potiphar's wife tries to seduce him, how Potiphar is forced to put him in prison, how he uses his skills and he is made the head of the prison, and how while there he interprets the dreams of two of Pharaoh's servants, the cupbearer and the baker. And then they have dreams in prison, and he interprets them as one's going to live, one's going to die. One will be restored, one will have his bones pecked clean while impaled on a stake. So this comes to pass. And then the Pharaoh has dreams, and it was the cupbearer 2 years later said, "Whoa, I remember this guy in prison." And so Joseph comes, interprets the dreams as being there's going to be 7 years. It's prophetic. 7 years of plenty, and then 7 years of famine. So you got to store up for the 7 years of famine. It seems a fairly simple theme. And so this Pharaoh said, we need to look, Joseph said, so Pharaoh needs to look for a wise and experienced man and put him in charge of the country. And then Pharaoh needs to appoint managers throughout the country of Egypt to organize it. And he goes on. And Pharaoh said, this is a pretty good idea. And then Pharaoh said to his officials, isn't this the man we need? And he points at Joseph. We going to find anyone else who has God's Spirit in him like this? And again, I don't think he's talking about Jehovah God here. This is a spiritual story. Does anybody else have God's Spirit? Says this king. And I don't think that's what he's referring to. He's talking about the spirit of the gods. He's talking about somebody who is invested with the gifts of prophecy, of foretelling, of knowledge, and so on. And so Pharaoh said to Joseph, you're the man for us, verses 39 through 40. God has given you the inside story. No one is as qualified as you in experience and wisdom. From now on, you're in charge of my affairs. All my people will report to you. Only as king will I be over you. Now, you've got to think that just from interpreting a dream, is Pharaoh, the head of a nation, going to put all his affairs in the hands of a guy he just pulled out of prison who had interpreted dreams? So there has to be some in-between the lines going on here. There has to have been some knowledge this king had of Joseph. Perhaps Potiphar, one of his high officials, who I don't think believed his wife's story of rape when he put Joseph in prison, he may have spoken highly of him. And if indeed he is the same person, because again, they're the only two Egyptian names found in the passage, Potiphar and Potipharah, it says that Pharaoh gives Potipharah's daughter to Joseph in marriage. And so maybe there is information that we're not given in the story, the superficiality of the story, that this Pharaoh has been given about Joseph. Hey, the guy is skilled. He knows how to run my household. He knew how to run everything for me, Potiphar may have said. And I think he can handle the business of running this kingdom and doing what you need him to do. So Pharaoh commissioned him. He puts him in charge of the country. Then he removed his own signet ring, the Pharaoh, and he slipped it on Joseph's finger. And he outfitted Joseph in new robes of the best linen, and he put a gold chain around his neck. And he put the second-in-command chariot at Joseph's disposal. And as he rode, people shouted bravo, or huzzah, or whatever you want to say. So Joseph was in charge of the entire country of Egypt. He was just made, without the title being mentioned, he was made the Grand Vizier. Now, Pharaoh told Joseph, I'm Pharaoh, but no one in Egypt will make a single move without your stamp of approval. So I think Joseph had to he probably had to, I don't think it was that easy to become the second in command of the nation. So there had to be more that I'm sure Joseph went through, but this is what Pharaoh gave him. And then Pharaoh gave him the name, an Egyptian name, Zaphenath-Paneah. And it says in the Bible, it means God speaks and he lives. And he also gave him an Egyptian wife, Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, the priest of On, in Heliopolis. And so there's a big question. Is this the same guy as Potiphar? Potiphar give his daughter in hand to marriage to Joseph. So Joseph took up all his duties over the land of Egypt. And Joseph was 30 years old when he went to work for Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. And as soon as Joseph left Pharaoh's presence, he began his work in Egypt. And during the next 7 years of plenty, the land produced bumper crops, and Joseph gathered up the food of the 7 good years in Egypt and stored the food in cities. And each city he stockpiled surplus from the surrounding fields. Joseph collected so much grain, it was like the sand of the ocean, that he finally quit keeping track. Joseph had 2 sons born to him before the years of the famine came. Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, the priest of On, was their mother. Joseph named his firstborn Manasseh, which means forget. How appropriate is that? This sounds more devotional almost in content, but why did Joseph say forget? Was it to forget his past? To forget what had happened? To forget all the things that brought him into this separation from his home and his family? But forget that, because now I'm here. Fagutsi, forget about it. And he said, God made me forget all my hardships in my parental home. And then he named his second son Ephraim, which is double prosperity is what that means, saying, God has prospered me in the land of my sorrow. And then Egypt's 7 good years came to an end, and the 7 years of famine arrived. Just as Joseph had said, all the countries experienced famine. Egypt was the only country that had bread. And when the famine spread throughout Egypt, the people called out in distress to Pharaoh, calling for bread. He told the Egyptians, go to Joseph, do what he tells you to do. And as the famine got worse over all the country, Joseph opened the storehouses and sold emergency supplies to the Egyptians. The famine was very bad, and soon the whole world was coming to buy supplies from Joseph in Egypt. The famine was bad all over. And then in chapter 42 of Genesis, it says, when Jacob learned there was food in Egypt, he said to his sons, why do you sit here and look around at one another? I've heard that there's food in Egypt, so go down there, buy some food, so that we can survive and not starve to death. So this is what's going to bring Joseph back into contact with his brothers. Now, as far as Joseph being appointed by a Hyksos king, I want to try to establish a little history to support that claim. And at the same time, I want to start looking at this idea that let's back it up a little bit and talk about how archaeologists have now debunked the idea, a 3,000-year-old idea, that the Hyksos didn't invade Egypt at all. And a study of human remains found in the Hyksos capital, Avaris, there's that city again, suggests that their century of rule over the Nile Delta was not the result of conquest, but a rise to power of long-time immigrants from the Levant. That's the area of like the Middle East and going up into the Middle East and Mesopotamia. Now, new research has been shedding some light on an ancient mystery, the origins of the Hyksos, an enigmatic nomadic people from the Levant that purportedly invaded Egypt more than 3,600 years ago, and they ruled the north of the Nile Valley for more than a century. Now, a scientific study, this is what's interesting, a study of human remains from the Hyksos capital has now confirmed something that archaeologists have suspected for a very long time. These feared aggressors, these Hyksos, were in fact not a unified people that hailed from a single homeland somewhere in the Levant and came as a horde of barbaric invaders, as some ancient historians proclaimed. The Hyksos were more than likely a new elite that emerged locally in northern Egypt from a melting pot of immigrants who had moved to the Nile Delta centuries earlier from different parts of the Middle East. It was the descendants of these immigrants who, during a time of unrest known as the Second Intermediate Period in Egypt between the dynastics, rose to rule over northern Egypt. And this is the conclusion of the study published, way back in, I believe this was written just this year. So it's the PLOS 1. So the story of the Hyksos has captivated scholars for the better part of the last 2 millennia. Who were these mysterious invaders? Who broke the might of the pharaohs? Who carved out a kingdom for themselves in the heart of ancient Egypt? Where did they come from? Why did they seemingly disappear from the stage of history as abruptly as they appeared, after being supposedly expelled from Egypt by a resurgent dynasty of native pharaohs from the south? So further compounding this fascination is the fact that some scholars, going back at least to the Jewish Roman historian Josephus, have suggested a link between the Hyksos and the ancient Israelites. These theories have mostly been based on the supposed common origins of the two peoples in Canaan and on parallels between the accounts of the rise to power and subsequent expulsion of the Hyksos and the biblical stories in Genesis and Exodus about the Israelites moving to Egypt, finding initial prosperity there, only to be enslaved and forced to flee. So recently, though, excavations in the Nile Delta have led archaeologists to doubt that the Hyksos were invaders at all, or for that matter, that they had any direct link to the Israelites.
Awesome and amazing graphic designer? How about an illustrator or a photographer? This is Rainey Roberts, and I wanted to tell you how you can get my designer, illustrator husband, Scotty Roberts, to work for you on your project. Do you have an awesome self-published book but no cover, or even worse, a cover that really sucks? Do you need a kick-ass logo for your company or some f***ing awesome graphic designs for your ads or website? Then get in touch with my husband for the best f***ing awesome kick-ass design and illustration. He knows his stuff, and he's been at this for more years than I've been alive. Go to ScottAlanRoberts.com. That's Scott with 2 T's, AlanRoberts.com to take a look at his online portfolio of work, or call 651-468-8115. Now go out and kick some ass with some kick-ass graphic design.
Hire my dad, so he can take me to Disneyland.
All right, gang, thanks for sitting on through that break. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to my show, the Intrepid radio program, right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. You can also be watching the video simulcast over on my YouTube channel, along with the live chat room of fellow Intrepids. That's over at youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Come on over, join the live chat room. Have a lot of fun tonight. Add your 2 cents worth, or just come and listen and talk about the show or other things going on. Now, we left off talking about the Hyksos and how more modern research, contemporary to today research, is really determining that these Hyksos were not invaders at all. They were people who, as I have said many times, I love this, the research is substantiating my hypothesis on the Hyksos. These are a people that lived there. They had infiltrated or come into the land of Egypt in the Nile Delta over a period of about 800 years. And finally, they had done what? They had assimilated into the Egyptian culture there. They assimilated into the villages and the towns, in the cities, the governments, the civic affairs of northern Egypt. They became citizens. And so eventually, they took advantage, what I believe was a break in the dynastic period. There was no son to the seated Pharaoh when he died. They took over in the second intermediate period, which is around the 1630s BCE. And for 108 years, they split Egypt and they ruled from the north in Memphis, the northern palaces. And I believe this is the time that Joseph and the Joseph story takes place. And there are reasons why I think this was the time period that Joseph lived. Now, 4 decades of digs, led by Austrian archaeologist Manfred Bietek, at Tel El Daba, the ancient northern Egyptian capital of Avaris, about 100 kilometers from present-day Cairo, served as the Hyksos capital, have not turned up any signs of destruction that could have been connected to the rise of these rulers, who controlled the region from around 1638 to 1530 BCE. So what archaeologists found instead was that already centuries earlier, from the turn of the 2nd millennium BCE, this strong Levantine influence, this Middle Eastern influence, became apparent in northern Egypt. Semitic names, Semitic burial customs, architecture, weapons, other artifacts attest to a large presence of Levantine people in the region already in the heyday of the Middle Kingdom, long before the infighting and the division that characterized the second intermediary period. So perhaps the most visible and famous example of this phenomenon is a nearly 4,000-year-old mural found in the tomb of an official Khnumhotep II, which depicts a procession of Levantine nomads bringing offerings of the dead. Let me refresh your memory on this. It is the picture on that mural that we showed you yesterday. And it is these guys right here, the Asiatics. And you can see this line of these Asiatics, these Levantine peoples, these Semitic peoples from Canaan and the surrounding area. This would be the Hebrew people. This would be the Canaanite people. This would be the Syrians and so on. And, of course, in that restored painting, they look like that. So that gives you an idea. So now these are the people that had been moving into the Nile Delta. And on the tomb of this king, Knumatep II. And the new research published adds to this evidence by studying not the material culture of the Nile Delta residents, but their actual bones, their physical bones. Specifically, the team led by Chris Stantis, who's a bioarchaeologist from Britain's Bournemouth University, he focused on the teeth of 75 people who were buried at Tel El Dabaa during the Hyksos period and in the preceding 3 centuries. And the study analyzed the abundance of isotypes of strontium found in the dental enamel of the skeletons and compared it to the isotope ratios of this element found in the bones of local animals. Small amounts of this metal, which is not harmful, are mainly absorbed through the food we eat, and we replace some of the calcium in our bodies. Stantis tells Harrods. It's all about the research. The clincher is that the isotope ratios found in nature vary from place to place. And since dental enamel forms between ages 3 and 8, researchers can figure out whether a person spent their childhood in a particular region or not. And in the case of Tel El Dabaa's skeletons, just over half of the individuals had spent their childhood outside of the Nile Valley. But this influx of foreigners did not correspond with the beginning of the Hyksos period in the mid-17th century BCE. It was instead a constant trickle that went as far back as 4,000 years ago. So in fact, when the Hyksos were ruling Lower Egypt, that's the Nile Delta region, the amount of locally born individuals increased. And additionally, in this period, most of the skeletons of the foreign-born people belonged to women, which again doesn't match the scenario of a military invasion. The preponderance of females at Tel El Dabaa during the time of the Hyksos rulers suggests that the members of the new elite, while locally rooted, married women from the Levant, possibly to cement alliances or for the sake of maintaining ties with their ancestral lands and extended families. And so the long-term immigration, these trends, and the gender imbalance revealed by the isotope analysis are further strong indication that the rise of the Hyksos was an internal takeover of Lower Egypt by the elites of Tel El Dabaa, says Deborah Sweeney, an Egyptologist at Tel Aviv University. Bitak's excavations at the site have shown that the opportunities offered by this prosperous trading hub and harbor located on one of the river branches of the Nile Delta had enriched these descendants of the immigrants, and allowed them to take advantage of the vacuum left by the declining centralized power of the pharaohs at the beginning of the Second Intermediate Period. And now it's fascinating to see corroborating evidence from a new direction which demonstrates that men from the Levant didn't settle at Tel El Dabaa in large numbers at the start of the Hyksos period, which is what one might expect to see if there'd been this hoarding invasion of northern Egypt. And kings, by the way, are not a people. What a new study doesn't do is pinpoint the exact area from which the Hyksos came from. Did they hail from Syria, the Lebanese coast, Canaan, which is now Israel? The answer might be more complicated than that. The strontium isotopes among the non-locals from Tel El Dabaa display a wide variability that are showing that these immigrants who came in and took over likely came not from one place at all, but from multiple origins across the Levant. So these migrants were more likely attracted by the more stable, drought-free living conditions offered by the Nile Valley and came to the Delta to be employed as seafarers, merchants, soldiers. And this melting pot of people of different origins cannot be identified as a single ethnic group, and the very term Hyksos should only be applied to the rulers of the breakaway kingdom of Lower Egypt, rather than to its people. After all, the word Hyksos is a Hellenized version of the Egyptian word, as we said yesterday, Hekakasut, which means rulers of foreign lands. And it was common already and shepherd kings as well, by the way. That was an earlier interpretation, and they changed that to be less the shepherding kings and more the rulers of foreign lands. And as the shepherding kings meant specifically the people from Canaan. And it was commonly used already in the Middle Kingdom to describe the kings of the Levantine city-states. And this was Daphne Bentor, who was the former curator of the Egyptian archaeology at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. So how did these foreign rulers morph into an entire nation of warlike invaders in the eyes of ancient chroniclers? They were men of ignoble birth, quote unquote. Until recent archaeological discoveries, the Jewish historian Josephus from the 1st century A.D. was our main source for all things Hyksos. In one of his books, Against Apion, the 1st century historian quotes an earlier account of the purported Hyksos invasion by Manetho, an Egyptian priest from the Hellenistic period, about the 300s BCE. So according to Manetho's history, as quoted by Josephus, these men of ignoble birth out of the eastern parts, quote unquote, swept into northern Egypt and burned down our cities, and demolished the temples of the gods, and used all the inhabitants after a most barbarous manner. So after long oppressing the Delta region, the invaders were vanquished by an insurrection led by a native dynasty of pharaohs, which had continued to rule over Upper Egypt in the southern part of the Nile Valley from Thebes, modern-day Luxor. And the Hyksos were then expelled from Egypt and wandered back to the Levant, ending up in Judea, where they founded the city of Jerusalem. Josephus' retelling of Manetho concludes. And now this is how Manetho, 3rd century BCE, 4th century, he's in the 300s, this is how he described the history of the Hyksos, and how Josephus, a few hundred years later in the 1st century AD, repeated that. Now it bears reminding that Manetho, whose work only survives in extracts by Josephus and a few others, lived in the 3rd century BCE, some 1,300 years after the Hyksos disappeared from history. And his own story was likely colored by the ideology and the propaganda of those who came before him. So according to recorded Egyptian history, the Hyksos kings were indeed defeated by the resurgent Theban rulers of Upper Egypt in the south under the pharaoh Ahmose I, who reunited the country, and he founded the New Kingdom and the 18th dynasty. And this power struggle between Upper and Lower Egypt was styled by the victors as a war of national liberation, and the Hyksos began to be presented as foreign invaders. And this representation could fuel the expansionism of the New Kingdom, which under famed pharaohs like Thutmose III, we talked about him with Moses. Thutmose III was the 3-year-old stepson to Hatshepsut, when his father, Thutmose II, died. And he was the rightful pharaoh. Hatshepsut became the co-regent with him. Then she moves him back into, back up north to Mennefer or Memphis, and she takes over as pharaoh. And this is during the time of Hatshepsut and Senenmut. So under famed pharaohs like Thutmose III, and then later, 200 years later, under Ramses II, they conquered Canaan and most of the Levant, and the purported homeland of the despised aggressors, the Hyksos, because they went to Canaan, and they brought the Egyptian empire to its greatest extension. Now the Hyksos invasion was presented as a shame that had to be prevented from repeating itself by controlling these lands. This is what Bentor tells Heratz. And the Hyksos were the devil incarnate, while the Egyptian king was the savior of the world. And I want to show you a quick picture here. This is a little relief plaque that shows Ahmose I killing a Hyksos. So there's your Pharaoh from the south, killing one of the Hyksos people from the north. And it was Ahmose I who cleared the Hyksos out after 108 years of their being on the throne in northern Egypt. He clears them out and he reunites Egypt as one kingdom instead of the two kingdoms, north and south, upper and lower. And when he does this, he then enslaves and subjugates the remnant of the people of the Hyksos that are left. These people that had been for hundreds of years moving into Egypt in the Nile Delta, he put them all to work. And now we don't know if it was as harsh as slavery. The biblical story of the Exodus talks about it being that the Hebrews were enslaved for 400 years, or if it's just talking about the fact that they worked for the Pharaoh. They were the common folk, like Senenmut. He was a commoner, which could have meant slave or living as a people of the servitude. And so the fear and the loathing of the Hyksos boogeyman, if you will, permeated ancient Egyptian culture for centuries to come after their ousting. And by Manetho's time, Bentor notes, there also is another kind of hatred circling in the country, and that was anti-Semitism. So tensions between Hellenized Egyptians and the Jewish communities in Egypt were often very high, particularly in Alexandria, and so much so that some scholars consider it as the birthplace of anti-Semitism. Alexandria, where you had the lighthouse of Alexandria, the library of Alexandria. So by the time of Manetho in the 300s. So it's plausible that Manetho's retelling of the expulsion of the Hyksos as an Exodus-like origin myth for the Israelites had little to do with history, and was more of an attempt to smear the Jews by conflating them with Egypt's legendary arch-enemy. And so most scholars today don't believe there's any direct connection between the breakaway rulers of Lower Egypt and the Israelites, aside from the fact that they both broadly hailed from the same region of the world, the Middle East. And at the very least, there's this gap of more than 300 years between the fall of the Hyksos and the first appearance of a people named Israel in a stele by the Egyptian pharaoh Merneptah at the end of the 13th century BCE. And there's nothing in between that shows any link or continuity between the two groups, other than their region of origin. So some, like Egyptologist Donald Redford, have suggested that the biblical study of the Exodus may contain distant Canaanite memories of the expulsion of the Hyksos. Now, I disagree with this because I don't think the expulsion of the Hyksos had anything to do with the Exodus. I do think, however, it had to do with the beginning of the enslavement of the Hebrew people in Egypt. Now, it's possible, but it's very low to prove. Very difficult to prove. And to date, there's no archaeological evidence to show that the story of the Exodus reflects a specific historical event linked to the Hyksos expulsion from Egypt. And so what seems more likely is that the majestic biblical narratives of the children of Israel moving to and fro between Egypt and Canaan are a reflection of the same phenomenon that is attested by the study of the human remains from Tel el-Daba, a centuries-long or even millennia-long history of migration, conflict, interdependency, and cultural exchange between two regions that houses some of the earliest human civilizations. Now, in the story of Joseph, in particular, I want to jump way ahead a little bit just to establish something here. We're talking about Avaris, that this is the city where Joseph dwelt. The Bible tells us that Joseph built a palace. at Avaris. I want to see, I've got some things I want to show you here, but I want to find the exact verse in the Bible that talks about this. Let's see. Blah, blah, blah. I might just have to look right here in the text. Let's see. If we go back to Genesis 42, there was food in Egypt, and then the brothers come. I'm going to go through that story, by the way. The famine got worse. Jacob came with his sons. There's a couple of chapters of this story expanding. Joseph eventually revealing himself to his brothers who had sold him into slavery. I want to cover that whole story, but I just see in the verse, in Genesis 45, verse 1, it says, Joseph, this is, now we're jumping way ahead in the story. The clan of Israel, Jacob, came with Joseph's 11 older brothers, and now a younger brother born, Benjamin, so 12 brothers. They come to Egypt during the famine. They don't know Joseph is alive. It's 20 years later from the time that they sold him into slavery. The whole coat of many colors issue. He's been, to them, the family of Israel, dead and gone. So the brothers go down to Egypt to get food during this famine, perhaps to move to Egypt. And when Joseph goes through this whole charade of plays and stuff, and there's this story that is written. And finally it says in 45 verse 1 of Genesis, Joseph couldn't hold himself any longer, keeping up a front before all his attendants, and he cried out, "Leave! Clear out! Everyone leave!" So there was no one with Joseph when he identified himself to his brothers. But his sobbing was so violent that the Egyptians couldn't help but hear him. The news was soon reported to Pharaoh's palace. By the way, it says in this, let's see, just before this, Joseph goes through all these steps to just to really torture his brothers. They don't know it's him. They don't recognize him. It's been 20 years. Joseph is now an Egyptian official. And so Joseph concocts these stories, and he's going to keep the youngest son with him in Egypt and send the other brothers back home. And your servant, my father, says Judah, told us, you know very well that my wife gave me 2 sons. One turned up missing. I concluded that he'd been ripped to pieces. I've never seen him since. If you now go and take this younger son, and something bad happens to him, you'll put my old gray grieving head in the grave for sure. And now can't you see that if I show up before your servant, my father, without the boy, this son with whom his life is so bound up, the moment he realizes the boy is gone, he'll die on the spot. He says, he'll die of grief, and we, your servants, who are standing here before you asking food, will have killed him. And that's not all. I got my father to release the boy to show him to you by promising, if I don't bring him back, I'll stand condemned before you, Father, all my life. So let me stay here as your slave, not this boy. Let the boy go back with his brothers. How can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? Oh, don't make me go back and watch my father die in grief. This is one of the older brothers of Joseph. And I believe this is Judah. Yeah, this is Judah. He had started this all by saying, Judah came forward and he said to Joseph, "Please, master, can I say just one thing to you? Don't get angry. Don't think I'm presumptuous. You're the same as Pharaoh as far as I'm concerned. You, master, asked us, do you have a father and a brother? And we answered honestly." And he goes on into this account of, don't keep the boy here. It'll kill my dad. And this is right after this scene is where it says that Joseph couldn't hold himself any longer, and he just cries out, tells all his servants to leave the room. Everyone leave, and he sobbed so violently. It says, the story says that the Egyptians couldn't help but hear him, and the news was soon reported to Pharaoh's palace. So Joseph spoke to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father really still alive?" But his brothers couldn't say a word. They were speechless. They couldn't believe what they were hearing and seeing. "Come closer to me." Joseph says to his brothers. They came closer. "I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. But don't feel badly. Don't blame yourselves for selling me. God was behind it. God sent me here ahead of you to save your lives. There's been a famine in the land now for 2 years. The famine will continue for 5 more years, neither plowing nor harvesting. God sent me on ahead to pave the way and to make sure that there was a remnant in the land to save your lives in an amazing act of deliverance. So you see, it wasn't you who sent me here, but God. He sent me in place as a father to Pharaoh, put me in charge of his personal affairs, and made me ruler of all Egypt. Hurry back to my father and tell him your son Joseph is alive, and he says, I am master of all Egypt. Come as fast as you can and join me here. I'll give you a place to live in Goshen where you can be close to me. You, your children, your grandchildren, your flocks, your herds, and anything else you can think of. I'll take care of you there completely. There are still 5 more years of famine ahead, and I'll make sure all your needs are taken care of. You and everyone connected with you. You won't want for a thing. Look at me, Joseph says. You can see for yourselves, and my brother Benjamin can see for himself, that it is me, my own mouth, telling you this. Tell my father all about the high position I hold in Egypt. Tell him everything you've seen here, but don't take all day. Hurry and get to my father and bring him here. Then Joseph threw himself on his little brother Benjamin's neck, and he wept. And Benjamin wept on his neck. Then he kissed all his brothers and wept over them. And only then were his brothers able to speak, and speak to him. The story was reported in Pharaoh's palace. Joseph's brothers have come. It was good news to Pharaoh and all who worked with him. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, tell your brothers this is the plan. Load up your pack animals, go to Canaan, get your dad, get your families, bring them back here. I'll settle you in the best land in Egypt. You'll live off the fat of the land. And then he gives them instructions of how to bring everybody over. And they did just that, the sons of Israel. And he gave them wagons and loaded them with grain and bread, provision for the journey back, and he sent his brothers off. And as they left, he told them, take it easy on the journey. Try to get along with each other. Kind of a kick in the butt. They left Egypt and they went back to their father Jacob in Canaan. And when they told him Joseph is still alive and he's the ruler over the whole land of Egypt, Jacob, Israel, went numb. He couldn't believe his ears. But the more they talked, telling him everything that Joseph had told them, and when he saw the wagons that Joseph had sent to carry him back, the blood started to flow again. Their father Jacob's spirit revived, and he said, I've heard enough. My son Joseph is still alive. I've got to go and see him before I die. And so Israel set out on the journey with everything he owned, his whole family, about 70 people. And they arrived at Beersheba and worshiped. They offered sacrifices to God. They went on to Egypt. And I want to get into more about why the timing and why I believe Joseph was under a Hyksos king here. There is one place, and I've mentioned this before, where Joseph says to his brothers when they come back, now we're going to give you the best land, but when you go into Pharaoh, you tell Pharaoh that you are shepherds and have been shepherds from your youth, because the Egyptians hate shepherds. Now, what the hell does that mean? Why would you say that? We've talked about this before. It's because the Egyptians were in the south. The Hyksos were in the north. The Hyksos were shepherding people. They were the shepherd kings, the Hyksos, the Hakushusat. They were from the same region. So they were cousins. And he said, make that affinity with Pharaoh. And we're going to get into that more tomorrow. We didn't get into any more of the pictures I wanted to show you, that they're more pertinent to what we're going to be talking about as we talk more about this series. But I want to show you one thing just to give you, as we're on our way out here right now, that Joseph built this palace. You see it in the background, in Avaris. And this is the outer compound that has, you can see almost center and upper left, all these tombs that are here. There are 12 tombs. They discovered this palace. I'm going to talk more about that palace tomorrow. And here in one of these tombs, they found this statue. Now remember what you saw about the Asiatics' clothing? We're going to talk about this more tomorrow and give you more information on that. So guys, sit tight. We'll be back in 23 hours. I hope you enjoyed this. We'll see you tomorrow. Thanks for being here.